While a generation I never grew up with, Pokemon Generation 2 was a generation that I did experience in some way, mainly through the Heart Gold Soul Silver remakes that released back on the Nintendo DS in 2010. Those games in my eyes today are considered to be the best that Pokemon offered at the time as a game and a remake specifically, with all the detailing of the Gen 4 sprite work and animation. But the more I look back at those games, the more I was realizing, I wonder what the original games were like back then. And so because of that feeling of wonder, plus the fact that I'm never gonna shut the up about Pokemon, I figured for this review, why not fully experience the original Pokemon Gold and Silver on the Game Boy Color? After all, back in my experience with Generation 1 proper, I actually admired the old sprite work design and how Pokemon was like when it was conceived. And trust me, again with this review, I felt like it's been a really long time coming since I've reviewed Pokemon Generation 1. Which now that I think about it, how long has it been since I even covered those games? Oh, that long, huh? Well, I sure fumbled hard. For now, let's start with some Pokemon history since it is important to cover our bases before diving into the game's content. Plus, I gotta make up for some of the time I spent not using this little guy. So, from 1997 to 1998, you could say that Nintendo and Game Freak were getting pretty busy. After seeing the success of Pokemon Red and Blue and leaving fans wanting more out of the franchise, you could say that the reception was high and it wasn't gonna come down anytime soon. Sure, back in 1998, there was Pokemon Yellow and Pokemon Blue releasing for the West and Japan to satiate that thirst. Being the first ever definitive editions of the original game, they didn't do much in terms of adding something totally new for the franchise, which was the main need and desire from the overall fanbase. It was then at a Nintendo Space World conference where they highlighted some important concept art, designs, and ideas that were once scrapped for the first game, now implementing them for this so-called next generation of Pokemon. Also, just in case I lost a lot of you guys there, Nintendo Space Worlds were like the Nintendo Directs before they were even a thing. Like, don't ask me much about this because, look, I'm 23 years old, dude. I can't even really explain much about the 90s other than what my parents told me about it growing up. Much like Generation 1 though, Pokemon Generation 2 would be on the handheld considering its predecessor's success, this time for the newly upgraded Game Boy Color, which, you guessed it, can now process color. It also presented a much sleeker and more modern design by 90s standards, providing more to offer to the eyes instead of that bleak monochrome palette the Game Boy original initially had. Like, yeah, what an upgrade. Now, don't ask me much about my thoughts on this handheld because, like I said, I grew up on the Nintendo DS, but given my basic knowledge on the system, I think Nintendo gave fans one of the best handheld systems of the time. Of course, the GBA is right there, but we're not about to throw hands here. You can wait for that in like Pokemon Generation 3 in 2025 or whenever the hell I plan to review that game. But you know what? To go back to what we were talking about, this actually worked well for the Game Freak in the end, as not only did the sprite work get enhanced, but the towns, cities, and locales look so vibrant to explore now. Pokemon battles look more dynamic compared to the first game thanks to updated moves and animation, and honestly, if I was a kid around this time, you bet your ass I would be glued to the screen because they really raised the bar in terms of overall quality. Looking back on this already after my playthrough, I admired these little details a whole lot more, and just seeing what they were able to do with just the Game Boy alone, you also gotta wonder nowadays, what the hell happened, Game Freak? I know I said it wasn't gonna be one of those videos, but at the same time, it's a point worth making as it really says a lot when it comes down to today's standards of Pokemon games. Much like any development cycle, of course, there were some problems, but there was one that almost caused the entire game to be scrapped and cancelled entirely. For those that know already, you know exactly what I'm about to say right now. For the people who have no damn clue what I'm talking about, well, this problem was due to a lack of compression for the files of both Johto, the new region of this game, and Kanto from the previous generation. Yeah, Pokemon Generation 2 was going to be big or go home, and this was all by implementing two whole ass regions to traverse through on a handheld that was the equivalent of a mini NES. Like, need I say any more? This would come with major issues in trying to fit the files together that it wasn't until the help of Satoru Iwata that the problems would get resolved. Yeah, the dude basically managed to compress the files and get the game ready for release, which was then highlighted as a special thanks to Iwata in the game's credits. Hell, Satoru Iwata was such a genius at compressing the game's files that he had to make his own compression tool to ensure the game would be shipped, as well as enhance their graphical fidelity, which already says a lot about the care and dedication this man had for gaming, period. Man, I sure miss this man so much. It was then that Pokemon Gold and Silver would arrive for Pokemon fans of Japan in November of 1999 and later for the West in October of 2000, not just with some cool textures and sprite work, but with some pretty cool Pokemon slapped on the box art. For those that got Pokemon Gold, you had the Rainbow Bird Ho-Oh, a menacing but fascinating creature that had this pose of authority. You really love to see it. And for Pokemon Silver, you would have Lugia, Well shit, now that I think about it, what is Lugia? A bird? Some dude with big ass hands? Propellers? Like, I don't even know what to probably describe it, but hey, it's box art, kinda has the vibes of, so you got games on your phone? But these bad boys, or gals, I'm not judging, they would start a trend for Pokemon games to follow in terms of presenting the box art for their respective games. Sure, the Charizard and Blastoise box arts are iconic in Pokemon standards, but I think I find Pokemon Generation 2 a bit more endearing, to be honest. Is it because I grew up being accustomed to look at a Pokemon game's box art with a legendary Pokemon or not? You be the judge of that. After their release, there will also be the release of a definitive experience by the name of Pokemon Crystal in 2001, this one being the go-to experience for many Pokemon fans. It wouldn't add much to what the other two games did already, similar to Pokemon Yellow, but it presented newer sprite work for certain Pokemon. It also improved the battle animations to make them more stimulating, as well as be the progenitor for what the next few Pokemon titles would present moving forward. Now, I would have chosen this one for this review given the nature of this edition being, well, the definitive one, but seeing that it doesn't have Mareep in its base roster and it requires it to be migrated from Pokemon Gold, and I don't have this on my 3DS and playing this through other means, if you know what I'm saying, yeah, I ended up choosing Pokemon Gold in a heartbeat. Look man, I'm not doing any extra work here, okay? And again, as for my personal experience with this generation, well, it's basically non-existent. So for this review, I'm definitely going in all blind, at least in terms of what the original games provided. Like I said, I did experience Johto thanks to the release of Pokemon Heart Gold Soul Silver for the DS back in 2010, which, now that I think about it, that was almost 14 years ago. Whoa. Time sure flies, huh? But despite my existentialism on the concept of aging and time, I think it's finally time for us to actually dive into Generation 2 properly and continue onwards with our long-awaited Pokemon journey here. So ladies and gentlemen, get ready for a whole new place and have a brand new attitude, because now it's time to still catch them all. Yes, that indeed was a reference, and I know it was cut short there, but you make do with what you can, am I right? So for this brand new Pokemon adventure we got going, New Bark Town is the place to be. A small and quiet little town, similar to Pallet Town, and one where we definitely get to start our journey all the same. Much like the previous generation, we are given our starter Pokemon, only this time it's from Professor Elm, a clumsy but means well Pokemon professor who studies Pokemon breeding. Something that as we get further into the franchise, we'll notice more and more as each Pokemon professor kinda specializes in something different. I mean, in Pokemon Generation 1's case, Professor Oak's entire research was the study of Pokemon and human interaction, so clearly for this new Pokemon professor, something needed to be done differently for him to stand out. And I have to say, I absolutely love Professor Elm, man, mainly because of how on brand he is as a Pokemon professor. You can easily tell that at some point in his life, he could have been Oak's apprentice before moving to Johto, and honestly with the amount of MILFs and DILFs we have seen as Pokemon professors throughout the games, yeah, this kind of feels a little bit more refreshing. Like, I'm glad to see how Pokemon professors were like back in the day. Though, I mean, I really can't say much because, you know, Seda and Juniper, Now, once you get your starter Pokemon, of course, the rest is for you to explore like last time, and in the case of Johto, contextually, things are very different unlike Kanto. For those who aren't familiar with the origins of Pokemon regions, Johto is more or less the literal other side of Japanese culture to kind of put it in that perspective with the real world. As Kanto dealt with the more modern and technological side of things, Johto is more cultural and traditional, the Kyoto to Tokyo, so to speak, if you know your Japanese history. And if you don't understand what I'm saying, please don't skip out on history classes. Like Kanto, you also got your various small towns scattered throughout to explore at your pace. You got Cherry Grove City as the tutorial city, demonstrating everything for the player before they decide to move on. You got Violet City with the first gym leader to beat, and the first major location to train with the Bellsprout Tower, which that was pure delight. Azalea Town at the Slowpoke Well as a nice little tourist attraction that sometimes I kind of forget is even a thing. And lastly, but certainly not least, you have the infamous Ikritique City with both the Burnt and Tin Towers that you get to explore later on as side content, as well as various others that emphasize the Japanese country aesthetics. Though, of course, you do have your modern-like cities in this game, Golorant City being the most apparent, since it sticks out like a sore thumb when we're looking at the regional map from afar. And there's Olivine City being the port city with the lighthouse, but like I said, cultural aspects are the focal point for this region, and I think Game Freak wanted to make sure of that when playing. The plot also reflects these aspects of Johto, despite the entire story obviously centering around you entering the gym challenge and exploring the region to catch, train, and battle to be the very best like no one ever was, but you also get to see how Johto interacts with the people around them the more you explore, giving a more personal feel to the adventure compared to the last generation. And because of this is why, honestly, I find this to be my reason for why I like Johto a lot. Now, I don't know about some of you guys here, but for me, it's a place where you get to travel and go on a sightseeing journey rather than just pitting fictional creatures together in a room and letting them beat the ever-living crap out of each other all for a profit. Like, yeah, I'll definitely be taking that, please. And of course, like any Pokemon game, you have your rival of the week by the name of Silver, a red-headed edgelord who is first seen staring at a window of the professor's house back in New Barktown. You can even interact with him prior to getting your starter Pokemon. Like, let's see, I wonder what he does. Ow, what the fuck? It's only later that after finishing an errand for Professor Elm that he chumps the poor professor and steals one of the starter Pokemon that would typically counter yours, as per usual in these games, with some exceptions that obviously we're going to get into details later. And as for Silver's story arc, well, if he even had one to begin with, it's all about wanting to be the strongest Pokemon trainer there is, often butting heads with you simply because you're in his way from achieving that dream. This also ends up being the catalyst for fighting the gym leaders and reach the Pokemon League, but that's honestly about it with this guy. Like, that's all you know about this redhead, so have fun with him. Game Freak most likely said while swimming in that nice pool of money they most likely made from this generation like they're Scrooge McDuck. Compared to Blue, Silver is like the mean and ill-spirited rival type, the Sasuke to your Naruto if you will, that constantly acts rude to you and to his own Pokemon, often finding excuses about why his Pokemon aren't strong enough every single time you beat him. It isn't until later on in the adventure that while stopping Team Rocket that he sort of figures it out with the help of returning character Lance, now champion by the way, which is pretty cool, you know, good for him I guess. He's not much of a presence though, I mean, since he's just here to tell Silver that the very reasons behind why he is even lacking in strength as a Pokemon trainer is because he lacks the power of friendship within him, and who could have seen this one coming? Obviously, this is to showcase the friendship mechanic that this generation introduces, which we'll obviously go into details later, but this rival subplot is bare bones at best. He's the mean, edgy rival who eventually learns to accept who he is and changes his ways. Who would have thought? And man, I wish they could have done more with that. I know that in Heart Gold Soul Silver, he does get some better treatment in the character development process, where as post-game content, we see him trying to find Giovanni. And in the Pokemon Adventure mangas, we see that he happens to be his son, which is cool and all, but that's way later down the timeline. Here he shows up, jumps an adult, proceeds to act all tough and mighty, only to get his ass whooped because of course it will, and that's about it. Funny enough, this actually all sounds rather ironic on my end because I actually like Silver as a rival character, but you know what, for his debut at least, it is what it is at the end of the day, and honestly it doesn't really affect how much I enjoyed this generation at the end. That, and we can't forget about Team Rocket. What, you thought they were gone? Oh please. Yeah, Team Rocket is back again to wreak havoc for these games, encountering them as you go through your Pokemon journey like in Generation 1. After 3 years of hiding, they're back from the underground in hopes of reclaiming their bad reputation of evil, this time being led by 4 Team Rocket executives who in this generation, they don't have names, and it isn't until Heart Gold Soul Silver that they are given some to add some level of character identity. But as for their initial debut though, man, they are so inconsequential to both the plot and Team Rocket as a whole. Simply put it, they are another set of Team Rocket goons for you to fight and nothing more. And again, this is slightly rectified with Heart Gold Soul Silver and in Pokemon Adventures, but we're not playing those games and reading the manga now, are we? And in regards to the entire premise of Team Rocket being back, it honestly feels very disorganized. Yeah, they're back to being the main villains, but I mean, you could have done a lot better here, Game Freak. They are not much of a threat as they were back in Kanto, and they give off more of a Saturday morning cartoon villain vibe with little or no reason to even be in Johto despite what I just said. They are even more sporadic as you encounter them at random points without much context, and while you can argue that this was the case in Generation 1, it's definitely way more apparent here. Be it to cut tales of poor slowpokes back in Azalea Town to sell for a profit, they're there I guess, I don't know. I guess they were trying to fill a villain quota somewhere out there, I can't really say. Or trying to force evolve certain Pokemon in Mahogany Town through the usage of the Lake of Rage, which I ask with a bit, but how though? Their rationale behind things are not much explained, and that bothers me. The only logical thing that they did was the siege of the radio tower. After gaining the 7th gym badge, Professor Elm tells you what is happening in Goldenrod City, as there, Team Rocket plans to contact Giovanni by hijacking the radio signals. Ooh, that's awesome! There's finally a stake in the game here, but that's later on in the adventure, and it feels so damn shoehorned in all for the sake of padding the story out. As you can tell, I don't like what they did to Team Rocket here. I wish they did a new team, or at the very least, explain their reasoning in Johto a whole lot better. Like, present the executives early on in the adventure to see that they really mean business, and actually try and get Giovanni to arrive so we can have one cool boss fight encounter with him. Like, that would have been super cool to see. But that never happens in the end, and Giovanni most likely took things very personal with Red after their battle a few years back. Like, yeah, bro really said, "F them kids." To give some credit to this game, this is the generation of Pokemon that provides a continuity between two generations, with Generation 5 kinda doing that later in 2012. As you explore through Johto and beat the next 8 gym leaders to become champion, you also get to explore Kanto as post-game content, learning more about the 3 years that happened between the first game and this one. During your travels in Kanto, you encounter older versions of the previous gym leaders and encountering new ones such as Janine, who replaces Koga as he now sits in the Elite Four this go around, and Blue, who now takes charge in Viridian City after Giovanni left, which is a neat little character development on his part considering how much of a brat he was in the previous game. Kudos to him to finally being mature about his loss and, you know, owning up and becoming a gym leader. Well, okay, that's a little bit of an exaggeration. He's still the same shithead as before. What's even better about this post-game content is that you even get to face against these gym leaders like before, and now adding the total of gym badges from a mere 8 to now a full-fledged 16 count. Something that up until now has never been repeated until Scarlet and Violet being like the closest with 18 whole badges. And to me, this alone adds merit to Generation 2, since this meant the game was a bigger adventure, connecting the bridges between two regions in terms of lore. And the icing on the cake with this one, it hands down the final moments of both game. Like after beating the last gym leader of your choosing, since there's no specific order, you can go as you please, but once you're all done with that, you get sent back to Pallet Town where Professor Oak tasks you to do one final thing, and that is to climb to the top of Mount Silver, as seemingly there is something waiting for you there. So after heading through there through the same means as you did to get to the Pokemon League, you go through the motions of the cavern system it has, and once you do reach the top, someone mysterious is waiting for you there, and the only means to interact with them is by getting near them, where a text pops up with no words, just 3 dots, and then in seconds gives the following. Holy crap, this is Red from the previous game, as in the very character you played back in Generation 1, giving us one of the most iconic Pokemon battles of all time. The way he just stares at you, sending his Pokemon one after the other, and how the theme kicks in the more you proceed, it just leaves you with goosebumps. Sure, Lance had the theme first, of course, but this belongs to Red and only Red, and no ratio on Twitter will convince me otherwise, so come at me at full force. But now that we are on the subject of music, the tracks for this generation are pretty great. It gives more to offer than Saber this go around, and really gives both regions a nice atmosphere surrounding them. The battle themes are also quite dynamic too. Personally, my favorites are like the rival battle, and again Red's because it slaps so damn hard, but even the overworld tracks like Egritique City, Violet City, and New Barktown are just as great to listen. They set the tone right and establish the world setting like the previous generation without overstaying too much of their welcome. Okay, well in some cases there are repeats in this game, so you know, I'm guessing at some point the budget had to snap, or Masuda had to snap, whichever came first I guess. Still, when taking a look from afar, Johto as a region and in story kind of does fall short when compared to its previous generations and even the later games too. Sure, a continuity was presented, tying both regions together both geographically and narratively, but the way it was handled and executed makes Johto a region that not only feels heavily reliant on Kanto, but one that just simply exists overall. And it sucks for me to even say this because I really love Johto, but I think that for most people that love this region particularly is because they experienced it firsthand with Heart Gold Soul Silver back on the Nintendo DS. In those games, I think they handled Johto a bit better thanks to the updated battle mechanics and also the sprite work, as well as the added Gen 4 evolution some Pokemon had, making the adventure more unique and memorable. Plus, they also gave us a Pokelathon, and that was peak fiction right there. I don't understand why they removed it in later games. But here, in all of its original Game Boy glory, it's It's fine, but you know, I just wish some things could have been handled better in the end. Traversal wise, you got the routes, cities, towns, and caves to obviously explore through, and the standard trainer battles to experience to, you know, train your Pokemon as well as earn money. All pretty self-explanatory, but make no mistake that the one thing that Johto has as a major ass detriment is the amount of HMs it threw at you. My god, why is there so many? Johto has 8 total HMs to use for traversal, with the standards returning from last time and 3 new ones to boot. You got Flash to light up dark cave systems, Waterfall to traverse through high sections of water, and Whirlpool to pass through, well, whirlpools that are seldomly seen unless you have plans to catch Lugia on the Whirlpool Islands. Seriously, the only real necessity of Whirlpool was to find a Dragon Fang in the Dragon's Den in Blackthorn City, all just to prove to Claire how much we deserve that 8th gym badge. Like, give me that shit. Yet, despite these small complaints, it would also be important to emphasize that Generation 2 did improve on a lot of things that are now used in today's current Pokemon games and meta. Of course, that's typical in any Pokemon game. You have the catching and training components as before, now being a major upgrade in both quality and in quantity. Given that there are now 100 plus Pokemon to capture and train for your adventures across both Johto and Kanto, there is honestly a lot of team diversity at your disposal, and some of these guys are absolutely my favorites bar none. From having an Ampharos, a Typhlosion, a Crobat, and many more on my team, these guys were the homies for this adventure, and I was honestly glad to have tried them out in their respective debut. Zulu the Crobat in particular, as I never used Crobats during any of my playthroughs firsthand, and because of this review, this purple bat holds very dear to my heart now. The same even goes with Quagsire and Jumpluff with their respective battles, working as both my physical attacker and special stat debuffer when it came down to it. And I even named my Furry here after a dear friend of mine too by the name of Virtual Mementos, which you guys should totally check out after this video is over. They made great stuff, and shoutouts to Virtual, because if you're watching this, a very big hello from me and my Johto team here. We can't also forget that this generation introduced to us the Dark and Steel type Pokemon, two types that originally were not in the first generation of Pokemon games as some often thought they were. Being respectively debuted by Gym Leader Jasmine and Elite Four Karen, they presented newer Pokemon and evolutions to previous ones. You had Umbreon for Eevee, you got Steelix for Onix, and Sizer for Sizer, each with new sets of moves to utilize. And their designs are pretty iconic too, and I can tell that because of these two typings that Game Freak really wanted to add more to the Pokemon world. Pokemon genders were introduced in this generation for the very first time as well, but it doesn't do much aside from the Pokemon breeding mechanic that we know nowadays, as introduced via Professor Elm earlier in the game by handing us the very first Pokemon egg that we hatch and train as our own. This is actually a pretty neat concept for Pokemon. It certainly makes it more alive in the sense that these creatures can now but I can't really say much in this game since I didn't really try out this mechanic all that much here. But man, if there is one compliment to throw at Generation 2 for what it did improve on the most, is definitely the UI design. As nitpicky as this sounds, it actually speaks volumes as to how eager Game Freak was to improve on the bugs, animations, and overall sprite work and look to the Pokemon games. Once again, thanks to the Game Boy Color, Pokemon now actually look like Pokemon, and we even got the EXP bar to show our progress whenever we win a battle. Yes, finally! Okay, well, surely this was like a bug here, right? Oh, Pokemon can have held items to increase their stats and boost their performances, something that benefits the battling aspects, and depending on what you give to which Pokemon, it does help to add more battle diversity, so to speak. It's very well handled today, of course, in modern Pokemon games, but the fact that it debuted here is what ultimately matters. And the same goes with the new stats that your Pokemon have, which, thank God, they fixed compared to the original. Hallelujah! So back in Generation 1, I spoke heavily about the ambiguity of the special stat and how wrong it felt from a mechanic standpoint, just giving us only a special stat, which honestly was pretty off. Here though, I am glad to see that they split that stat in both special attack and special defense. Even though we won't get the special to physical attack move split until like Generation 4, but hey, you gotta start somewhere at least. And then there's the friendship mechanic, where for certain Pokemon to evolve, you need to not only level them up normally, but also take good care of them. This is mostly stressed through gameplay where you just have them in your party first and they just fight wild Pokemon and trainers. Like seriously, you're gonna be spending most of the time running back and forth in the tall grass sections of each route just to train them, so just do that and call it a day. The day and night cycle also originated from this generation as well, where daytime and nighttime are established within the software of the game. This essentially allowed you to venture to the region in the day and night while encountering different Pokemon in the same routes you visited before, adding a level of replayability if you plan to catch every single Pokemon out there. Lastly, and I think everybody's personal favorite for this generation, we gotta talk about shinies. Thanks to the color processing that the Game Boy Color had, as well as this game, the concept of shiny hunting finally came to fruition, where it's nothing but hoping that your favorite Pokemon suddenly becomes a different flavor. Now, because of the rarity shinies are in encounters, yeah, I didn't spend hours and hours in tall grass to rate my chances, but just seeing that iconic red Gyarados, damn, that must have been cool to see back in the day. But as you can see, there are a lot of new additions this game presented for Pokemon that honestly it was pretty insane to think about in retrospect. Like, I didn't even get a chance to cover the Pokegear, your portable phone that allows you to rematch certain trainers whom you get your phone numbers from, which I didn't do much to be honest. Again, because of the outdated nature that this game has, the side stuff wasn't all that appealing to me. Hell, I didn't even talk about the custom Pokeballs you can get from Kurt in Azalea Town, who would require apricorns to make them, something that was brought back thanks to Pokemon Legends Arceus in case you weren't aware. But yeah, no, if you asked me, I would just cover these more in depth if we ever review the remakes for these games, like who knows when. I mean, this is the Game Boy Color, and as much as I really like this game, this is also an old ass game, so that meant sometimes when you wanted to go off the beaten path, it felt like a chore rather than something enjoyable, which the same holds true for the roaming legendaries in this game. For this generation, your trio was Entei, Raikou, and Suicune, all three found in the underground section of Ecruteak City's Burnt Tower. Now, once you interact with them, they basically go in their separate ways, and it's a matter of RNG and finding them, which, yeah, I am not doing that at all, no sir. But I cannot express enough that the content of Generation 2 is pretty grand. I mean, it definitely expands upon Pokemon's core formula for generations to come, being consistent with it to this very day. And it leaves me happy to see that Game Freak really were all in making this into a proper sequel. Generation 2 in some ways, I'd argue, feels like a game that was made to provide a good lasting feeling for the player that enjoyed the first game, and you can clearly see it. Of course, it does have its flaws, make no mistake about that, but there is nothing in hindsight when compared to the amount of good it generally presented in the long run. But there is one last thing in terms of flaws that I didn't really cover though, as despite the good qualities, we can't forget about the difficulty curve this game also presented, which, in just 2 words, you know exactly what I mean. Whitney's Miltank. There, are you happy? Because I sure as hell am not. Like, man, that was something. In all seriousness though, the difficulty does feel a bit all over the place with Generation 2. At times you find yourselves breezing through routes and gym leaders like it's a simple picnic summer stroll, only to then be faced with a large ass curveball that leaves you wondering if were you even playing the game right? And this is Pokemon of all things too, like that's really saying something because generally Pokemon games are not meant to have this intensity placed upon the player, especially towards a bunch of kids who were owning these copies back in the day. The most notable of this is of course Whitney, the third gym leader with her beefy ass milk tank that tanks hits and hits hard with how high her attack stats are, but you also see it with Jasmine and Claire later on in their respective battles. By the time I hit Jasmine, my starter Pokemon isn't even fully evolved yet, and Claire expected most of your Pokemon to be in the low 40s, which also wasn't the case. Clearly, there was almost zero adjustments to the battling difficulty, and that's a bit concerning because Generation 1 didn't really do that as much in the early sections of the game. On top of all that, you also saw that the Elite Four and Champion here, though not as severe of a level curve as last time with all the level 60s being thrown at you, there was still pretty large of a gap for you to cross. Oftentimes, I found myself going back and forth again in the tall grass sections just to reach a comfortable level gap that would save some time from additional grinding for the Kanto gym leaders to come, but that also was a pain in the ass too, given that they had their own level gaps to fill in, like come on. Because of grinding alone, it made this review take way too long to cover, having to rinse and repeat just to get my Pokemon ready to fight Red in the end, which I was still under level by like 5 levels. I mean, I still won the fight in the end, but talk about overdoing it this time, Game Freak. God damn. This in turn really did feel like bad game design on part of Game Freak's, like for sure, but I like to think that it was unintentional given how large this game was for a handheld at the time. I mean, yeah, it would be understandable that some things would be left unchecked under a final inspection, like I totally get that, but it still wouldn't have hurt to look at these things and fix some of the rough patches before, you know, shipping it out to market. But then now that I think about it, they didn't even do that with Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. We know how that game fell in the end, am I right? But overall, Pokemon Generation 2 showed a lot of promise back then and still holds true today, especially with how many Pokemon games we've gotten since then. Man, I can't even count at this point. Sure, the movesets are outdated and the roster is severely limited, but if you really want to go back to an older generation of Pokemon games that wasn't Generation 3 or Generation 4, then I think this is the one for you, personally speaking. Like, it gets the job done at being a sequel by just adding all those new mechanics that I mentioned, which Generation 1 lacked when it originally released. That or just get your hands on Heart Gold Soul Silver, since again, I can argue that's the better Johto experience, but that's for when we get to that, again, who knows when. To kind of close all of this, in a sense, the best way to describe Pokemon Generation 2 is that it is imperfect. It has all the qualities and content that makes it the sequel needed for Pokemon, but it lacks in other aspects that makes the previous generation kind of better to some capacity. Johto kind of missed the mark in fully fleshing out ideas and concepts it presented that thankfully later generations would do that afterwards. It still does a decent job at making good use of them and honing in on the more important fixes that Generation 1 didn't have when it released. And personally, like I said, I definitely enjoyed my time with Generation 2, and surely this one will be one for the history books, because like Pokemon Generation 1, seeing how Pokemon was like in an era that I never grew up with is something to behold and makes me appreciate the older games a lot more, especially as we move on to the next generation. And it makes sense for some why this generation in particular is considered a special place for many people growing up with the franchise, and seeing that I grew up with its remakes, the sentiment still kind of feels the same. The Pokemon battles were great, the trainers we faced were truly the most fun to experience, and that final battle against Red is definitely one that to this very day remains an iconic moment for not just Pokemon, but for video games in general. Like, that is for certain. Finally, we end the chapter on Pokemon Generation 2, because I'm pretty sure a lot of you guys were waiting for me to actually do this review, so here you go. I finally did it. Like, here it is. Go enjoy, go like, comment, and subscribe and all that, because I really need to see the money, okay? But throwing all that aside now, this does mean that I gotta continue my journey on Pokemon now. I mean, clearly, at this point, I might as well continue treading the waters here, and the next time we actually do want to talk about Pokemon and review Pokemon is gonna be with Pokemon Generation 3. Yeah, we're jumping consoles already, from the Game Boy to the Game Boy Color to now the GBA with Pokemon Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. So it's gonna be pretty interesting stuff. Highly recommend when that video decides to show up here on the channel. But yeah, it's gonna be fun. It's gonna be fun. Also, by the way, if you have not had the chance yet, go listen to that Pokemon Johto song. Like, that is just peak fiction, and honestly, like, you're gonna have a grand old time with that video. Trust me.